I mean, in summary, you could say that the big argument is that for us this is the 1918, 1945 or 1989 moment of our generation. It's a moment when the world order balance and dynamics are changing. Sometimes they happen after wars, like after World War I, World War II, or sometimes after periods such as the Cold War. And we're sort of somewhere in between. And we know that orders usually last, or at least have in the past century, 20 years as they did after World War I, 40 years as it did after World War II, or 30 years as it did after the Cold War. And what initiated the change in the current liberal world order, I would argue, was Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. So we're talking February 2022. I fully realize that this is a rather Western perspective of looking at things, but I admit fully in the book as well that my identity is Finnish, Nordic, European, transatlantic. So I look at my analysis looks a lot through that lens. And of course it has now been accelerated, this change and transformation with the new US administration. And the triangle of power for me is the global West, which used to be led at least by the United States, trying to preserve the current liberal order, the global East led by China, which was more supporting multipolarity and a new order, and then the global South, which unfairly I lump 125 countries into. But for me, that is the area and entities of the world that will actually decide what the next order looks like. And of course now things move quite fast. I think the thesis still holds, but my big idea is that you kind of have a choice which is fairly binary, but probably it's gonna land somewhere in between. You have those who support multipolarity, which is about transaction and deals and actually spheres of interest, so not far from what we saw in the 19th century. And then you have those who support multilateralism, which is about international institutions, it's about rule of law, it's about norms, and basically the liberal world order that existed. And my final point, if we want to preserve the liberal world order, we need to give agency to those countries around the world which feel that the current order was built 80 years ago in the image of the West and especially the United States. So give more power to the rest of the world, because I still think that there are more multilateralists in this world than there are transactionalists. So this is the big idea of the book, and in many ways a defense of the liberal world order and of course of open societies as well.
Here's a hot take. If you have a
So it's a really interesting framework for thinking about what's going on. And you are positioning yourself against the tide of history on a lot of these different areas. You're a liberal in a world where there is a kind of big political movement against liberalism, which is particularly advanced in advanced democracies like the US and European countries. You're a multilateralist in a world where power politics is increasingly defining how events take place. And you say that you're a proud Atlanticist in a world where the meaning of the West is kind of fundamentally changing. How do you find a way of reconciling the world that you want to live in with the one that you're having to operate in on a daily basis? Yeah,
I mean, so there's one thing I say in the book, and I've said out publicly as well, and also in a foreign affairs piece, which I published a little while back, and is that in foreign policy it's important that you deal with a world that exists, not what you want to exist. And for that framework, I then came up a few years back with this concept of values-based realism, which essentially means that you stay true to your values, democracy, in my case, democracy, freedom, human rights, fundamental rights, protecting minorities, rule of law, supporting the international world order. But at the same time, you're realistic that you cannot solve all the world's problems, like conflicts or climate change or AI, only with like-minded countries. So you need to come together somewhere in a place to deal with it. I have to admit that when I crafted values-based realism, I wasn't really thinking about having to do it with the United States, but I have to admit that there is an element of that. So it gives me space, and it's not a doctrine as such, but it's an instrument to take us over this period of transition. I know Mark Carney talked about rupture, and he might be right. He's a bit.
You've converted Mark Carney, but how do you get beyond?
It's kind of the biggest achievement in my life. I mean, Mark Carney quoting values-based realism, but no, I mean it's kind of the idea is. Then you have to ask yourself the question, okay, how do you do this? Well, a good starting point in my mind is another instrument I try to outline there, which is dignified foreign policy, because I feel that, we have a lot of conversation about history, about a post-colonial world, about colonialism, and we always look back into history for examples on how we have been treated. So my take, and of course I come from a rather inoffensive country, with a limited colonial past, which means that it gives me kind of street cred to do that. So I talk about dignified foreign policy. In other words, you have to behave towards the people that you want to work with in a respectable way, which seems to be lacking a little bit in the world right now as well, I have to admit.
So we've been through this extraordinary psychodrama over the last couple of weeks around Greenland. I think without a doubt, in my mind, it's the biggest transatlantic crisis that we've seen since at least Suez. It looks like things are kind of being resolved, but I think it is quite important to take some lessons from what's happened over the last period of time. What do you think the main lessons are?
That we live in an unpredictable world, and there will be curveballs coming at you in foreign policy virtually every day. I don't remember a Davos, and I've been here 11 times, where in the first 21 days of the year we've had Venezuela, we've had Ukraine, we've had Greenland, we've had Iran, we've had Gaza, just to name 5 conflicts that have been tossed around. We just have to take these curveballs one at a time. In the Greenland issue, right in the beginning when it started, you had 2 camps. You had those in Europe who wanted to de-escalate, and then those who wanted to escalate to de-escalate. And I think most of us sort of worked in both of these spheres, so we were looking for instruments which would try to tone down the language by threatening escalation on different types of measures that the European Union has. But the key for me was to look at 3 possible outcomes or scenarios. One was good, one was bad, and one was ugly. The good one was that we would get an off-ramp and then a process which would strengthen Arctic security. A bad one would be an escalation in tariff wars. And an ugly one would be a declaration of military intervention in Greenland. And I think in the past 3 to 4 days, where we pretty much worked around the clock with Mark Rutte and Jonas Störe and American senators and others, we were able to escalate to de-escalate and end up in zone number 1. So good outcome. But at the same time, I can't say that this won't have an effect. Of course it does, because one of the key principles of the international order and how you treat alliances is that you respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of each and every one of us. But we were able to deal with it short term, and now we have to look what we come up with long term.
So what do you think the short-term lesson is that you need a mix of showing that you're serious by filling the vacuum, both militarily with threatening to use countermeasures
and frenetic diplomacy. It's just you just have to work the phone, and you have to do it behind the scenes.
And in terms of the longer-term questions, I mean, you're a very passionate European. You've worked for the EU institutions as well as for your own government. You've been part of this fundamental transformation of Finnish identity from being a kind of neutral country to being one of the most passionate defenders of European sovereignty and of the EU. What do you think Europeans need to do now in order to make sure they can be sovereign in this new world that we've been talking about?
The first just general observation is people don't realize this. Finland is actually the only Nordic country which is 100% EU member, in the sense that we are in the
No
euro.
opt-outs.
Exactly. We don't. We're in the euro and we don't have any derogations. And I think that the original decision for us to join the union in 1995 in a referendum was based on security, though we didn't want to talk about it at the time. We never wanted to be alone again, so we did that. And of course on NATO, which I wish we would have joined much earlier, we ended up joining it also because attacked Ukraine. So what's my advice to my European friends? That is to say that don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We've been in transatlantic crisis before. You mentioned the Suez Canal. France left NATO. There has actually been regime change, or elections have changed leaders in Germany because of placement of different types of military equipment in Germany because of the transatlantic relationship. So I think be pragmatic, use the values-based, be true to your own values. So that means that you look for places where you can cooperate with the United States and the current administration. The war in Ukraine is an obvious one. NATO is another one. In my case, icebreakers. Probably not in the case of the rest of you, but we work with the American administration on technology. We work with minerals. But at the same time, we can't do it naively. We have to be cognizant of the fact that there's a lot of movement in the transatlantic partnership right now. But fortunately, Finland's bilateral relations with the U.S. is really good, so we are in a good place. But when you do that, realize that there are going to be areas where you're simply going to disagree. And you can tell that either publicly, which some people do, or then privately, which I do. So it could be issues linked to international institutions and American withdrawal from the multilateral system, or it could be on U.S. unilateral action. It could be on climate change. It could be on how we defend democracy, both at home and abroad. It certainly was on Greenland, where you don't have to be an expert of international relations to understand why Finland staunchly supports Denmark and Greenland. So you just have to be open in this relationship. And when you do that, I think there's 3 levels. One is, of course, for me, the direct contact with the president. But I don't have no illusions. I mean, Trump whisperer, nice, but I mean, I whisper or text, and most of the time he doesn't listen. So, so be realistic about it. Second level is people close to Trump. And the third level is actually the first branch of government, Senate and Congress in general. So you just have to work very pragmatically at it and believe that this transatlantic partnership will survive.
So before we all became experts on Greenland and Greenlandic security, the biggest European security question was about Ukraine and its future, and that is something which is very much still on the cards. And we hear that Steve Witkoff is going to fly off from Davos.
Never sue the person who hit